Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Charles Murray is likely, in fact, almost certainly, the single most influential social scientist of our lifetimes. He is the co-author, famously, of The Bell Curve, which, beneath the controversy, was a remarkable book on many levels. He is the author of Coming Apart, which foretold more crisply than any book ever written where we are right now. And he's now the author of a brand new book. It's called Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America. Charles Murray joins us now, and we are honored to have you, for real.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you
very much. So I have a million questions to ask you, and I'm thankful that you came. But first, I want to get right to the book, which I have not read, I will say. I don't have a copy, haven't read it. I've only read about it, and it hasn't gotten a ton of publicity in the popular press.
Not yet, no.
So, but I suspect it will. What is it?
It's the product of last summer. You know, last summer I've listened to the narrative after the riots and the protests and so forth. And when they were talking about, the police and terrible policing in the inner city, I said to myself, aren't they even mentioning that the environment that the police work in the inner city is vastly more dangerous than the environment in a suburban neighborhood? When they were talking about we don't have enough managers in senior positions in Microsoft and places like that. And I'm saying, don't they even mention how few blacks there are who can qualify under the current situation for those kinds of positions? I didn't want them to use that information to discount the problems in policing or discount the problems of racism in the job market. I wanted them to acknowledge the fact there are group differences that go a long way toward explaining some of these other inequities that are at the center of attention. And so finally I got mad enough at it, I said, I got to write a book. And then as I got started on it, Tucker, I began to realize that what's going on with critical race theory and identity politics is a repudiation of the American creed. It's saying the founding ideals are wrong. And I had to fight back against that.
So let's start at the beginning. What are the founding ideals that they're repudiating?
It's, you're not old enough maybe. The American creed used to be a phrase in common use. It was based on the first paragraphs of the Declaration. All men are created equal. They are born with inalienable rights. And what it boiled down to was, in America, you can go as far as hard work and talent will take you. You are the equal of everybody else. You're the equal in terms of the law, and you are equal in innate human dignity. You know, individual. You got to treat people as individuals. You can't treat them as members of groups. Right. Identity politics says you must treat people as members of groups. The power of the state must be used to foster social goals that bring another group up preferentially to meet another group. Well, okay, I understand that they think this is wonderful idealism. It in fact repudiates what has made America America.
So their rejoinder would be, and is, it was always a lie. That was never possible.
Yeah, well, there are two things. One is, did we fall short of that? Yeah, absolutely. No question about that, starting with our failure to repudiate slavery in the Constitution. Fine. It was also the motive power behind abolitionism. It was the motive power behind first wave feminism in the 19th century. We made more progress toward treating people as individuals than any other country in the world, even during the 19th century. We continue that in the 20th century. The civil rights movement culminated, emotionally anyway, with Martin Luther King's speech at the Washington Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial. That was an evocation of the American creed from beginning to end, right down to that iconic final line, I want my daughters to be treated because of the content of the character, not the color of their skin. This creed, and the phrase hasn't been used now for decades, was what set America apart. And we were doing great. And then we threw it all away.
Really abruptly. And why did that happen?
Well, the first place, the civil rights movement reflected a very deep injustice in the American system. We did, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, essentially set it right legally. We said all the laws that discriminated in any way by race, we said you couldn't do anymore. Okay, that's great. With one hand, we grasped at the American creed in one of the most dramatic gestures we ever had, and within a year, with the other hand, we threw it away in the sense that we said, oh, well, actually, because we need to make up so much, it is appropriate to treat blacks differently from whites in a preferential way. And initially, it seemed innocuous enough, but in retrospect, it was leaking a poison into the American system. It was saying, well, it's okay occasionally to treat people as groups. It's okay occasionally to use the power of the state in favor of one group more than another group. And that is a very slippery slope, as we have found out.
So between the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the institution of affirmative action in our system, pretty short period. So like
it was 1 year.
1 year. So lots of questions arise from this, but the most obvious is, I guess it didn't work.
Oh,
affirmative action.
It's way worse than not working. Look, it was foolish from the beginning to set equality of result as the goal. And the reason I say it was foolish is that even in 1966, when this got started, we already knew at that point that there were big differences in black and white test scores, academically. We also knew, because of the Coleman Report, great big government study, that it wasn't the quality of the schools that explained that. That was a big surprise in that research, but it was true. So therefore, we knew at the time, you couldn't say we're going to have equality in terms of the proportion of black physicians or the proportion of black engineers or biology teachers. It was going to take a long time. And what we should have been doing then is to focus intensely on giving blacks a fair shake. That a black person could be assured that first they would hear about a job being available because employers would make special efforts to do that. And secondly, they could be sure that when they got into that job interview, they would be judged on the merits of their qualifications in the same way that whites were, and they would not be denied a job because of the color of their skin. If we had focused on that.
The promise of the Civil Rights Movement, in other words.
Excuse me?
The promise of this. I mean, you just described the promise, exactly. At least publicly articulated.
So that they would be judged by the content of their character.
Right.
As individuals. If we had been measuring progress in that sense, we would have been able to celebrate a whole lot of progress. Instead, we said we're going to measure progress in terms of equality of outcome, whether it's proportion of black physicians or whether it's income or anything else. And lo and behold, the progress has been really slow and it's been unsatisfactory. And a kind of tacit agreement took hold whereby whites would be too polite to mention that, well, there's a reason for this in terms of the available people for employment opportunities. But we wouldn't mention that. On the other hand, blacks would not blame it all on whites that they weren't making progress. Now, Tucker, we're talking about immensely complicated stuff. For whatever complex series of events, we end up in 2020, 2019, 2018, with the rise of critical race theory, of identity politics, and suddenly it's all whites' fault. It's white supremacy, it's white privilege, it's systemic racism, and we painted ourselves into a corner. By we, I mean those of us on the center right and center left, because right now, critical race theory says, what else could it be except racism that still explains these gaps in outcomes? Well, part of it is a difference in the means and distributions of cognitive ability. We haven't been willing to say that, so this book does.
So you laid the table for this, set the predicate for this decades ago, almost 30 years ago, I think, when you wrote The Bell Curve.
Yeah, it was 1994.
1994. With a colleague from Harvard who passed away, I think, before the book was published. One chapter of that book dealt with race. The rest didn't. I personally found that book more useful in understanding the kind of class system that we now have than anything I've read before or since. I thought it was a brilliant book. The race stuff aside. Explain just really quick, I know it's complicated, it's a very long book, but explain why cognitive ability, as you put it, is kind of a central factor in understanding how wealth and power are distributed.
Point number one, and I can't say this too often, our watchers should imagine italics and underlined when I say IQ is not everything.
Right.
It is, however, in large groups of people, predictive of certain differences in outcomes. It is predictive of performance on the job. It is predictive of performance in school. This doesn't mean that it's determinative. It's just significant. So if you have 100 incoming students to a university with an IQ of 110 and 100 with IQs of 130, the classroom performance of those two groups will be very different, okay? And that's the distinction that people have to keep in mind. When you look at an individual and you see, well, this person's black and this person's white, that does not mean the black person is dumb and the white person is smart. Far from it. Millions of blacks are smarter than millions of whites. In the technology, terminology, it's overlapping distributions. It does mean that if you admit black students who are on the average 15 points lower in IQ to a university than the white students, you are going to have most of the kids at the bottom of the class be black. And if you do the same thing on the job, you hire 100 cops and there is a major difference in their IQ, you will still have some really good black cops. You probably have some bad white cops too, but there will be a difference in mean performance. And these things build up over time in terms of the reaction that they draw from the people who are being subjected to these systems. And I think they're negative for both blacks and whites.
What does that mean?
It means, for one thing, that you are taking a population of middle class and working class whites, and you are saying to them in ways that are visible to them every day on the job that they have been put at the back of the line. So that if you're applying to the police academy, there are a lot of black guys who got into the police academy ahead of white guys who had better academics or test scores and being admitted to the place. If you have a promotion to sergeant, you have black cops who are promoted and white cops are saying, you know, that guy shouldn't have been promoted because he's promoted because he's black. Now, at this point, Carl, Tucker, I want to make sure that we understand one of the effects of this among whites who are around a lot of blacks in jobs. And that is it probably makes them less racist than any other group of whites in the country. Let me explain why. Let's go back to the example of cops. I could use also the example of teachers, of nurses, of other groups where you have lots of mixed race in the workforce. A black cop can say two things to himself. I'm sorry, a white cop can say two things to himself at the same time that are both true. One is he will have lots of black colleagues who are really terrific cops, people he likes and admires and respects. He will also see some black cops who shouldn't have ever been made police in the first place, that they were brought in as affirmative action. I think probably police and teachers and nurses in these situations are treating people as individuals, not judging them on the basis of their race, in a far more productive, healthy way than people living in a rich suburb who have virtually no black people living in that suburb whatsoever and thinking in terms of race relations in the absence of any personal experience whatsoever.
Yes. Boy, that's very noticeable, too. Very noticeable. People who live in and work in mixed race environments, I think, are much less likely to generalize because they think of the people they deal with as people.
Yeah, that's right. And they know in a way that a lot of other whites do not know that judging people as groups is really wrong.
Yeah.
Now, all of this has meant until the last decade that you could have a lot of affirmative action going on without a lot of repercussions in the society at large.
A lot of resentment.
Because, in fact, a modus vivendi had been reached. With the last 4 or 5 years, as the accusations against working class and middle class whites, and especially white males, have increased in intensity and viciousness, with whites being responsible for all of the ills of blacks, you have had 2 very different reactions among whites. One of those is the reaction of last summer, where members of the white elites were banging their foreheads in the ground in apology, saying it's our fault, we've been racist, we haven't realized it, but we have, it is systemic racism. We saw an awful lot of that. Meanwhile, you had the much larger population of white middle class and working class people who were not insulted into agreement. They were hearing these accusations of how terrible they are, and they're saying to themselves, wait a minute, I have been friendly and respectful of black colleagues. I am not a racist. I have done nothing wrong, and suddenly now I'm told it's all my fault. There is out there in the white population pushback that's already, I think, visible in subtle ways. I think that pushback is going to get stronger as time goes on. And here's where my crystal ball gets very, very cloudy. The situation is this. You have 13% of the population, that's the proportion of blacks in the US population, who are accusing 60% of the population, which is the proportion of non-Latino whites, of being bad, evil people. That's kind of a self-defeating strategy. And what I'm scared of is that whites are going to start adopting identity politics themselves. They're going to say, well, okay, if it works for blacks, if it works for Latinos, hey, we're an identity too. And they will start to have political views and advocate policies that are based on their identity as whites. And if that's the case, if all the races are agreed it's okay to use the power of government to benefit our guys against the other guys, that's disaster politically.
What does that look like?
Well, until recently, I was very skeptical of comparisons with the 1850s. You know, hear them occasionally. This is like the run-up to the Civil War. And I said, nah, it's nothing like that. And then I remembered what a famous historian named Bernard Bailyn used to say to his fellow historians, which is that the difference between the historians and the people that were writing about is that they didn't know how it was going to come out.
Yeah.
And unless you get in their heads, you can't understand why they did what they did. And I am less inclined to say that these comparisons with the 1850s are far-fetched. I think that the possibilities for an undeclared civil war are greater than they used to be. And here's where the scenarios can get very unlikely, but possible. For example, the U.S. government depends on its enforcement of EPA regulations and OSHA regulations and all the other thousands of regulations on local agencies. They don't have the staffs on the national agencies to enforce them. They rely on states and communities to do the job for them. What happens if South Dakota says, well, we'll get to your stuff occasionally, and de facto stop enforcing directives out of Washington? I'm not saying it's going to happen. Suppose that did start to happen. Suppose that what happened with marijuana laws in Colorado and other states, which contravene federal law, suppose that kind of unilateral insurrection, legal insurrection, were to spread. I don't know how that would play out.
Well, sanctuary cities, we just saw this.
Yeah.
So you say we're not enforcing federal immigration law.
There's already been examples on the left of that. The marijuana laws didn't get challenged because, it was the Obama administration and they were sympathetic to it. So not complying with federal law was acceptable. I'm saying that this kind of attitude is occurring right now in the face of a federal government that is distrusted by about 90-odd% of the American people, according to Gallup polling. A percentage that has been extremely low for a long time and used to be a percentage of trust that's very low compared to trust in the federal government that was at about 75% in the 1950s. So you've got a legitimacy problem with the federal government, and it's also happening in the face of the political polarization that's been so obvious in the last decade. And with both sides digging in ways we have never seen before. So what happens the next time the Republicans take the Senate and the House? Do the Republicans start to behave as the party for whites to pass laws that favor whites? I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm saying that that kind of identity politics is more likely now than it used to be, and it is potentially catastrophic.
I agree with that completely. And this, I mean no disrespect, but that's a very obvious point that you just made.
Yeah.
If you force identity politics on the country, at some point you're going to get white identity politics.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that is a disaster. I don't want that. I don't think any normal person wants that because it's zero sum. But that's such an obvious point that you wonder, has that occurred to the people pushing identity politics? It must have, right?
That's what puzzles me, because I use that 13% versus 60% comparison. It's like poking a stick at a very large, strong animal and thinking that the very large, strong animal is going to be infinitely patient. It's when you use those kinds of analogies, I think it raises the wrong image.
But why would you do that? I mean, why? Right? I mean, I don't see a good outcome to that at all. I can't imagine how anyone else could imagine a good outcome to that. So you have to conclude maybe they want a bad outcome. What's the other answer?
No, I cannot get inside the heads of the spokespeople for CRT. Right. I cannot understand why they would think this is tactically or strategically a good idea. And I guess I shouldn't speculate. I just don't know.
Right. I don't either, but I'm really bothered by it. What I do know is that, I mean, I'm speculating here, but you seem like a very moderate person. You're often described as a radical. But whenever in those rare occasions I've read you write about yourself, your own views and your life, rather than just pure social science, you seem very center-right, as you said, not a radical at all. And yet you are treated as a radical, big time. And I want to play this as one of many examples, but this was the reception you got at Middlebury College in 2017, where one of your children went, when you tried to give a speech. I think we have a short clip of that. So I guess the upside is you're not a politician, you're not a demagogue, you're basically an academic. You are an academic and a researcher and a social scientist. So at least they're taking ideas seriously. But why? Why are they so mad at you?
Well, race is the third rail, and it always has been, of American politics. Nobody wants to talk about differences in races, Nobody wants to believe that there are any differences that cannot be fixed by better education, better nutrition, less poverty, and the rest of it.
Wait, let me just ask you to pause there. And by the way, I'd love to, I'd rather not talk about race at all. I don't like the topic. I hear the opposite, though. I hear what the leaders of the left, or whatever this revolutionary movement is called, saying is that the differences are so profound that they define us completely. The differences are all that matters. They seem to be emphasizing the differences.
Well, but that's in the context of systemic racism. So it's not that the first place, the argument is there is no such thing as race.
Right.
That race is sort of infinitely variable. It's a social construct. It doesn't have any reality. And there is, however, the social construct of race, which says some people are black and some people are white. And because of systemic racism, you have these differences in outcomes just because people are being held back by an evil system. So they're willing to talk about differences in the context of systemic racism. They aren't willing to talk about, for whatever reasons, whether it's genes or environment or whatever, you have different test scores. And this has implications for classroom performance. It has implications for performance on the job. And it's a social consequence that should figure in our calculations about public policy. In terms of crime, which we haven't really talked about, but is an important part of the book, the violent crime rate among blacks in major cities is anywhere from 7 to, well, in the case of Washington, D.C., close to 20 to 1. Whites over blacks. And when you have that kind of difference in violent crime, you're going to have very different kinds of policing that go on, not because the police are racist, but because the police are responding to the environment in which they find themselves. These statements that I just made are ones which says, hey, everybody, let's let this be part of our equation as we try to figure out what to do about all this. And that's the thing that people don't want to acknowledge. It's going to be very interesting to see what the reaction of the book is.
But I'm confused, and I want to, after this question, let's get into the details that you present in the book on the question of crime. Because suddenly crime is a political issue, among other things, right now, because it's risen so dramatically. But it's such a weird posture to take. Many thousands of Americans die every year from violent crime. If many thousands were dying from pharmaceuticals or eating certain kinds of vegetables, you would ask yourself, like, what kinds of vegetables? What pharmaceuticals? Like, what's killing these people? You would want to know all the detail that you could. And you would hire someone like you to assemble the numbers so you could make rational decisions about how to mitigate the harm, right? Right.
All right.
So why wouldn't you be honest about crime if you wanted to prevent it?
If you say that for whatever reasons, the violent crime rate among blacks is 10 times that what it is among whites, people don't want to talk about the immediate consequences for that situation. They want to talk about, well, how can we fix it? Which I sympathize with, but how do we fix it is a separate question from what do we do right now in order to deal with the situation which faces us. So the same thing goes with differences in IQ. I understand the impulse to say, we've got to figure out a way to fix this. But what I'm trying to say in the book is, that's fine. Go ahead and devote attention to that. You must also recognize the reality of what is right now on the ground and understand that certain kinds of outcomes exist that are not explained by racism, let alone systemic racism. They are explained by differences that exist for whatever reasons between different ethnic groups. And by the way, we mentioned blacks and whites only. Have not mentioned Latinos, have not mentioned Asians, but in those cases too, you have very different groups of people for whatever reasons. And we ought to start talking about that stuff because the unwillingness to face that is pushing us to the brink of disaster.
So what are the realities? And let's just talk before we get keep delaying the crime conversation, but income distribution, for example. We know that a small group of heterosexual white men control all the money in the United States.
Right.
That's the result of systemic racism.
Yeah.
So as a researcher, tell us what the reality of income distribution is in the United States.
First place, can we take the billionaires out of the equation for a minute?
Because they're anomalies by definition.
Yeah, they are way out there at the edge of the bell curve. The more important question is, why do you have income differences among people in very similar kinds of jobs? And the answer there goes to a variety of things that have some relationship to such things as differences in IQ. So that if you have, well, I have the data in the book. Essentially, you have registered nurses. And we have data on fairly large numbers of registered nurses, black and white. And the difference in mean IQ between the two of those is a dozen IQ points, which is a lot. It means you have a whole lot of extremely able black nurses. You have some incompetent white nurses, but it does mean you have a difference in job performance. And that's eventually going to be reflected in income as well. It's going to be reflected in the nature of their careers and the nature of how they end up and so forth. Same thing goes with virtually all kinds of jobs. The same thing goes for the kinds of jobs people end up in, so that you have entry into certain kinds of occupations is limited because the cognitive demands of those occupations mean that a whole lot of more white people qualify than black people, and even a higher proportion of Asian people qualify than white people. These are all differences which are driven not by irrational racism. They are driven by day-to-day realities of job performance and the responses of supervisors to job performances and the demands of the market. I'm not saying all of it, by the way. In all of this, in talking about these things, is Murray saying that racism is no longer a factor in American life? No. Racism is a factor in American life. I'm saying that you can't understand the size of the factor it is without understanding the proportion of the differences that are reasonable and logical and predictable.
So the justification for overthrowing the hegemony of white men is that white men are at the top of the economic pile. Is that
well, except that they aren't. The highest median incomes in this country are not for white men. It's I haven't looked at the specific numbers by ethnic group, but the Asians, I think, are considerably higher.
Indians,
I think South Asians are high.
Yes.
East Asians high, South Asians high. And if you get within the white population, Ashkenazi Jews are higher than Baptists and Presbyterians. You have all sorts of differences, all kinds of things. The idea of the white Protestant male being at the top of the heap in this country, I think, is outdated, to say the least.
How outdated?
How outdated?
Yeah.
If we're talking about a high school graduate who's a white male versus a high school graduate who's a black male or a Latino male, and trying to get a job in a variety of positions, such as the occupations I mentioned earlier, such as being a policeman, such as qualifying for college and the rest of it, the lowest representation of any group in the elite schools is lower and middle class white males. That's you want the group
lowest?
the group that has the hardest time getting into elite schools, given their qualifications, are middle class and lower class white males. I mean, it's an obvious reason for it. The elite schools, they want to have a lot of blacks. They have to have a lot of Asians because the credentials that the Asians bring to the applications are so high. They want to have the appropriate number of women, and Latinos, of course, too. And then in terms of white males, well, they've got a lot of legacy white males applying, and they want to keep the alumni happy. That doesn't leave much room for the son of an electrician in a town in Kentucky who has perfect scores in his SATs or very high scores in his SATs. There are just not enough spots left for him. Now, that kid can get into a good state university, but when it comes to the institutions that everyone is slavering over, the elite institutions, he's at the back of the line. But he's also has to go to the back of the line for almost any kind of government job where aggressive affirmative action is most common. So, talking about white privilege is okay with me if you want to talk about recent graduates of Yale and Harvard. I don't think it's white privilege. I think it's an elite privilege, but you can call it white privilege if you want. To talk about white privilege or male privilege for the rest of the population is just silly.
But they're doubling down on that. And in fact, we're not just talking about it, but we've organized the whole federal government around the belief that it exists.
Yeah, and I think that what we fail to realize is the numbers of people out there who are angry. When I say we now, I'm talking about people in Washington, whether they're in think tanks like I am or whether they are in government. They are, well, maybe they aren't anymore. For a long time, they have underestimated what would happen if enough of that population out there in flyover country, enough of that population of middle class and working class whites got really pissed off. And I think that starting with the election of Donald Trump, we started to see the manifestations of that anger. I think that we may have seen nothing yet, because I don't see any signs that's diminishing. I see signs it's increasing.
So I want to ask you a human nature question. So you're describing a world in which the threat, if the son of the electrician from Altoona ever posed a threat, but whatever that threat is, has been definitely mitigated by the people in charge. Like, that guy has no power now. So once you've vanquished your enemy, don't you feel kind of sympathy for the person? Why do you hate him more? Why do you want to grind it in his face? Why do you rejoice when he dies of a fentanyl OD?
You are talking about a cultural shift that is as baffling to me as I imagine it is to you. Why is it that you have had, in so many different ways, all sorts of institutions be attacked that don't really deserve it? White males don't really deserve it. The family has not deserved, the traditional family has not deserved the attacks that have been levied upon it. Religious people, Christians, evangelical Christians, have not deserved the attacks that they withstood for so many years. And so on through the Rotary Club and the Kiwanis Club do not deserve the derision that's heaped on them by the elites.
That's right.
Across the board, you have had an elite culture develop in this country that expresses contempt for all sorts of historic, traditional American institutions that actually function pretty doggone well. And those institutions have been degraded. So you ask me why, having vanquished those institutions, can't they ease up? It's because of a cultural divide. And I'm talking not in terms of color and black and white, I'm talking in terms of elite America versus the rest of America. You have a cultural divide where in many ways the elites in this country are as divorced from ordinary people as the English aristocracy used to be divorced from the English yeomanry.
And they kind of know it, and they're afraid. You can feel how afraid they are.
Who's afraid, you think?
The people in charge. That's this endless talk about white supremacy is such a threat, it's bigger than ISIS. Like, there are no numbers that show. That's like insane, actually. But they know that they're provoking some kind of backlash. They're probably right. They can feel it coming. That's why they're clamping down on speech. They don't want you to say the obvious because they fear what will happen if you do.
Yeah. they may see that. The problem is they see it as being white racists, white bigots, stupid people. And it's not. It's ordinary, mostly. Are there white supremacists and white nationalists? Yeah, there are. I think their numbers are trivial.
I've never met one.
Yeah.
It's
What we're really talking about are ordinary citizens who have been under assault for a long time. And this is what I want the center left to recognize. My audience for this book is really the center left. I want them to recognize the extent to which the anger that they are looking at, whether it's the storming of the Capitol or whether it's the refusal to wear masks or whatever you want to talk about, the anger that they see is the product of a series of assaults that they have endured now for decades. And I went through the list of institutions a few minutes ago, starting with the family and religion and the rest. And you had 25 years ago a white middle class and working class population that largely wanted to be left alone. That was Grover Norquist's famous.
Yeah, the Leave Us Alone Coalition.
The Leave Us Alone Coalition. And we knew a lot of those kinds of people out where we live in rural Maryland. They were unhappy with what was going on with regard to the family and religion and so forth, but they were not angry at anybody else, and they just wanted to be left alone. And they were not left alone. There has been one hammer blow after another against the institutions that were the center of their lives. And now what we're looking at after a long period of this kind of assault are people who are fed up and aren't going to take it anymore.
So that's the third time you said that. And I just can't overstate for our viewers who haven't read Coming Apart, it is the most prescient. I mean, it's a snapshot, but it's also a prediction, kind of. Mm-hmm. That book explains the Trump election and explains where we are now to such a powerful, I don't know when the last time you reread your own book was, but you should reread it because it's that unbelievable. It's almost like prophetic. It is prophetic. That when you say we've got something scary on the way if we don't back off, it gets my attention. You seem to mean it.
Well, Tucker, back in 1994, Dick Herrnstein and I, my co-author in The Bell Curve, said if things go on the way they are, we are going to end up with a caste-like society with people on the top. And
what was so amazing, though, about that book, so that's what I took from the book, that when the industrial economy dies, the knowledge economy, whatever it is, takes its place, cognitive power becomes the currency. You're going to get a really stratified society. Some of this is, passed on by genes, some of it to some, we don't know what extent, but you're going to get like a hard and fast caste system. That was the real point of the book. No one ever talked about that.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, some people talked about it. They didn't do anything about it. Tucker, as I think back over our conversation here, and we have a lot of people watching us, there's something I haven't said that I would like to get out there and put on the table.
Please do.
And that is that a whole bunch of black working class and middle class people and Latino working class and middle class people are on board with the notion of wanting a country in which the goal of colorblindness, the goal of the melting pot are still attractive.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
And so when I say I want us to repudiate identity politics and return to a set of ideals in which all Americans are equal under the law and all have equal innate human dignity, that is a huge majority of the American population of every ethnicity. I'm absolutely confident. If that's the case, we've got to tell each other that we've got to say out loud that we believe this stuff, and we've got to stop letting the people who say that color blindness is hate speech. We've got to stop letting them dominate the conversation, and we've got to identify this overwhelming American majority which still loves what made this country special in the beginning. And that is not limited racially. That is a common, abiding part of what it means to be an American that I think is broadly shared.
I agree with that 100%. But if you continue to pick at the race wound, I'm afraid people become permanently divided.
This is why
that.
I was so reluctant to write this book, because I don't want to pick at it either. But until we recognize the degree to which systemic racism is not the explanation for our problems, we aren't going to be able to say, let's get back to what binds us together.
What kind of, and as I said at the outset, I never even received a copy of the book, so I don't know if it's even out yet. That's how excited we were to talk to you about this, and how, having read a bunch of your other work, I had complete faith in your scholarship. But I'm interested, of the people who have read it, what kind of response have you received?
Well, so far it's such a selective group that it's mostly people who are sympathetic.
So it's like your wife and kids at this point.
Well, I didn't say my kids were sympathetic.
You did.
No, my wife was understanding, and my kids were saying, "Dad, really?
Yeah.
Do you have to do this?" Tucker, we will not know what people think about this until we start to get the reaction from the center left, because that's the place that I'm interested in seeing. Will the center left say, well, Murray's a right-wing ideologue, but even so, we've got to pay attention to this alternative narrative that he's offering us? Or will they simply go back to racism, white supremacy, bigotry, that sort of thing?
So you
I don't know.
sincerely believe that minds can be changed. Clearly, you didn't write the book for me.
Well, I'll give you an example of optimism, and I will say it's George Packer, who writes for The Atlantic and the New York,
Yep.
and I hope that I'm not wounding George Packer's career by saying this. He had a recent article in The Atlantic, and I think he has a new book out.
I read it,
And
The Four Americas.
Well, you know what? I read the article in The Atlantic, and I would quibble with him on a bunch of stuff.
Me too.
Does he get it?
Yes.
He does.
Yes, I
and
agree
he's a
with
man of the left. So it is
He's
possible.
pretty honest guy. I mean, he's blinded. My read was he's blinded by some of his cultural biases, as we all are.
And he thinks we are too.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
But we're on the same
George
page.
Packer at least is trying.
Yeah.
That was my view.
And that's what I'm hoping. I want to provide cover for people who have wanted to talk about these issues, but it's just been too dangerous for them to do so. If you are a 38-year-old assistant professor hoping for tenure, you cannot write a book like this. You cannot raise this subject. You will never get tenure. And you can also be in big trouble in a variety of other positions if you raise these issues. The cancel culture is real. And so I'm hoping this book will enable them to say things that they were unable to say before. Well, probably while dissociating themselves from me, but that's okay. I want them to have a little more room.
So it sounds like the only reason you wrote it was to help the country. I mean, at this point, you probably don't have any other reason to write a book like this. You don't need to be more famous.
This is going to, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. I had the feeling that at this point in our history, if you have an audience, if you have a platform, and you don't use it, then you're derelict in your obligation. That what we are facing now, Tucker, is not a crisis as usual. It's not the things that we found wrong with Bill Clinton or with Barack Obama, the rest of it. What we are looking at is an inflection point in American history that could very easily go the wrong way. And so what we will be left with is a country that still has the name America. It's still the world's leading economic and, or at least military power and a very powerful economy. We aren't going to be America anymore. We're going to be just like other big powers, and our government is going to be run with the same kind of partiality toward your group over the other groups that has been the norm throughout human history. America was genuinely an exception, a unique country when we started. And if we lose that uniqueness, then there's no way to make America great again because America's not going to be America.
I have to ask, you're not a petty man, I can tell, but I just want to give you an opening for pettiness, if you have a second. You said that it's incumbent on people with an audience in a moment of crisis, and I think all would agree this is one, to say what they think is true and to try and make things better and try and bring people together rather than to divide them and to kind of add their voice to the conversation. And so many haven't. And so many people who you know very well and have spent your life with in the academy and think tanks in Washington, and just from being a famous guy for the past 30 years or more, as you have been, 40 years. Like, are you kind of shocked that some of your colleagues, center right, center left, whatever, have kind of sat this out because of cowardice?
Yeah, well, yes. Are there a bunch of people who I think need to step up? Yes, that's true. However, you also have a bunch of them who are speaking out, and I'm not going to name them because you know what? Me naming people is not a good thing for a lot of them. But I see signs out there of a variety of people who are trying to make their voices heard. However, your main point is, do I think that a great proportion of America's elites are behaving disgracefully in their unwillingness to say what they think? Yeah. They are unwilling to say what they think.
It is disgraceful. Last question. You started out as an academic and as a facts guy. Did you ever think that you would wind up in the position you currently occupy culturally?
I don't know what that position is. Tucker, you're on TV, and so you get lots of feedback all the time about what's how you are coming across with your audience. I live out in a little town in rural Maryland. I seldom go into D.C. I write a book every 3 or 4 years, and I hear people say things about me that, and my role, whatever that may be, and I have no way of calibrating what that role is. I know it sounds funny to put it that way, but I have no sense of that role.
It's probably good. So you live in a little town in rural America. Mm-hmm. You write about America, its social fabric, its distribution of wealth and power, and you know the country well. You're from here. You grew up in this country.
Yeah.
What are the healthy parts of America?
We can talk about something really positive now. I think that once you get outside the megalopolises, that Tocquevillian America, I'm talking about Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. I think Tocquevillian America is alive and well. And I will take as an example, not our little town, because when you have a town of 150 people, kind of hard to say that that's typical. But we're near a town of 70,000 people. Pretty good sized town. Frederick, Maryland is its name.
Yeah.
And you know what? Tocqueville would recognize the way that Frederick is run. It is run by people of different classes and colors. The elite does not think of itself as an elite. They don't look down on the other people in Frederick. They don't consider themselves culturally different. There are voluntary associations of all kinds that are scrambling around, helping people and solving problems and the rest of that. I think that Frederick, Maryland is typical of most small cities in this country. I think that the great divide right now is not between the left and the right. Well, that's symptomatic of the divide, but the real divide is between the megalopolises and everywhere else.
Yeah.
Everywhere else, people live different kinds of lives, where they leave their doors unlocked when they go out for the house in the middle of the day, where the people they deal with, who are electricians and plumbers and all the other people that you interact with in your life, are people that they know by name and that they have relationships with. It's outside the megalopolises. We really can live our lives as we see fit with a lot of without a lot of oversight, and we can do just fine, thank you very much. So it's a world in which American freedom is still functioning the way that it originally was supposed to. Whereas you get into the megalopolises and it's politically and logistically and technologically and in a variety of other ways a different world. And that world is one which is different for ways that are inevitable. But I will tell any of the people watching who would like to live in Tocqueville in America, it's out there. You just got to leave Los Angeles if that's where you're living, or some of the other megalopolises. And you'll find an America out there which is very traditional and works very well.
I can confirm that. Charles Murray, what a great conversation. Thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.